or biblical creation, or Darwin's theory? Which is more scientific? Well, according to the theory of evolution, the Earth is billions of years old, and life began in the oceans as tiny microbes around 3 or 4 billion years ago. Now, life requires certain types of complex molecules, special arrangements of atoms. And according to the theory of evolution, these were formed as ordinary chemicals just happened to come together in the right way. Ordinary chemicals, they say, randomly shuffled in some chemical soup, came together to form the essential molecules for life, such as proteins and DNA molecules. Proteins are the main components from which living organisms are made. They also help to do the work that goes on inside organisms, such as speeding up chemical reactions and producing energy. The DNA contains information, a kind of software program that directs and controls this work. The DNA also contains building instructions, such as genes, which enable organisms to reproduce, to make copies of themselves. And over millions of years, we're told that these molecules just happened to come together with other bits and pieces in just the right way to form the first living organisms. Microbes that lived in the oceans around 3 billion years ago. And this process, whereby ordinary chemicals supposedly became the first living organisms, is known as chemical evolution. Chemical evolution is step 1 in the evolution story, step 1 in the alleged evolutionary process. Molecules to microbes. And then, over millions of years, we're told, these microbes evolved into all the plants and animals we find on the earth today, including people. That's step 2 in the alleged evolutionary process, step 2 in the evolution story, microbes to man, otherwise known as Darwinian evolution. So according to the theory of evolution, this microbe on my left is my great-great-great millions of times grandfather. I don't know whether you feel you can see much of a resemblance. And this, we're told, is how it happened. Over millions of years, we're told, microbes evolved into more complex marine creatures, which evolved into the fish. And over millions of years, we're told, these fish evolved into amphibians and on into reptiles, and then mammals, and monkey-like creatures, and ape-like creatures, and finally into people. Now, in respect of step 1, how ordinary chemicals supposedly evolved into the first living organisms, even the most ardent evolutionists will admit that they have no idea how this could have happened. Professor Stuart Kaufman is one of the leading lights, the specialists in this field of origin of life studies. And he wrote this: "Anyone who tells you that he or she knows how life started on Earth some 3.4 billion years ago is a fool or a knave. Nobody knows." Even Professor Richard Dawkins admitted such in an interview with Ben Stein in the documentary Expelled. Dawkins said, "We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule." And Stein asked, "How did that happen?" And Dawkins replied, "I've told you, we don't know." And Stein asked again, "So you have no idea how it started?" And Dawkins replied, "No, nor has anybody. Actually, for step one, the problem is really worse than this for the evolutionists. You see, what we know from science indicates that chemical evolution would simply never happen. According to the known laws of chemistry, the molecules needed for life would not slowly build themselves up. Rather, they would tend to break down and fall apart. And there's certainly no observed process, no observed natural process that appears remotely capable of assembling the molecules in the right way so that they could actually do something useful. Of course, the top evolutionary scientists know all this very well. How then can they still claim that evolution is a fact? Well, the answer is very simple. They have faith. They believe that if they continue their research, they will discover natural processes that can build the molecules needed for life. And it's quite a remarkable faith that they have, because it flies in the face of known science. Indeed, all this shows that evolution, in fact, is not a science. It's a belief that actually runs counter to science. But with respect to step two, how the first living organisms supposedly evolved into people, some evolutionists claim that there is a natural process that we observe that can explain this. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. But contrary to what we're told endlessly through the media, there are in fact many serious scientific problems with Darwin's theory. We don't have very much time today, so we can only look at a few of these problems. But if you'd like to know more, there's plenty of good material available. You'll find Refuting Evolution by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati very helpful. Some time ago, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States produced an educator's guidebook entitled Teaching About Evolution and the Nature of Science. And in his book, Refuting Evolution, Dr. Sarfati responds to these arguments point by point. Refuting Evolution 2, by the same author, responds to a similar attempt to argue that evolution is scientific, this time in a series produced by PBS TV. If you've got youngsters at high school or about to go to university, these two books will give them a sound basis for countering the arguments they'll meet for evolution. Darwin's theory, as I hope we're going to see today, is not science. It is secularism masquerading as science. And these two books make this very clear. Now, the theory of evolution is really not difficult to understand. If you can understand a family tree, you can grasp the basic idea behind Darwin's theory. This is part of my family tree. Right at the top here, we have my four-greats-grandfather, John Statham. I'm down here somewhere on the bottom left. And this is the evolutionary family tree. Right at the top, we have the alleged ancestor of all life, which would be our great-great-great millions of times grandfather. And here, the dotted lines represent millions of years and millions of generations. So after millions of generations, we're told, this microbe at the top would have evolved into a fish, and this then went on to evolve into amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals. So according to this view, according to the theory of evolution, all these animals on the bottom line are our distant cousins. Well, you may be interested to know that as Bible-believing creationists, we have no problem with part of this family tree. We have no problem with family trees like this. They simply show that there can be variation within a particular kind of plant or animal. In fact, we believe that God designed plants and animals with the capacity to vary within their kind, so as to be able to adapt to different environments. When Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, he collected some samples of the finches he found there. And after he returned to England, he realized that he'd collected the different species of finch from different islands. And what's particularly significant about this is that each species appears to be specially suited or adapted to the kind of food found on the island where it lives. If the food source on an island is hard seeds, there will probably be finches like this one on the left, with strong, stubby beaks capable of crushing those seeds. Other finches have beaks like this one on the right, enabling them to probe flowers or fish insects from the crevices of trees. And Darwin believed that one original species of finch had flown to the Galapagos Islands from the mainland and then diversified into all the different species we now find there. And he was probably right. And he may also have been right in understanding that these arose in part through natural selection. For example, where only finches with the right beak shapes survived on each of the islands. But let's be clear about this. These kinds of family tree show that finches can become other species of finch, or that fruit flies can become other species of fruit fly, or maybe that lizards can become other species of lizard. They're not scientific evidence that reptiles can become birds, or that apes can become people. The sort of variation we see in this slide is sometimes referred to as speciation, where a number of different species arise within a particular kind of plant or animal. And this concept of a kind is fundamental to an understanding of biblical biology. Now, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 1 and verse 11, God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees, according to their various kinds." And then again, in verse 21, we read that God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird, according to their kinds. And again, in verse 24, God said, "Let the land produce living creatures, according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And we find plenty of examples of variation within these kinds. We see variation within mankind, within the horse kind, within the dog kind, and also within plant kinds. But it's important to note that while we see variation within kinds, we see distinction between kinds. Variation within each kind, but distinction between kinds. The natural world is not like the animation we saw earlier. The different kinds do not merge into one another as that suggested. Now, from time to time, evolutionists claim that they've found a fossil that's transitional, that's part way between two different kinds. But these are very few and far between, and they're rarely, if ever, very convincing. And if evolution were true, if the animation we saw earlier were correct, we would expect to find many transitional fossils, forming clear sequences leading from one kind to another. If evolution were true, we would not expect to find just a handful of questionable examples of transitional fossils, which is really all the evolutionists have. The various kinds of plants and animals, known from both the fossil record and the living world, fall into separate, distinct groups. Many evolutionists know this and puzzle over it, but creationists can rejoice in it because it confirms the truth of the Bible. So as biblical creationists, we have no problem with family trees like this, showing variation within a kind. The first finches that flew to the Galapagos Islands could have carried all the genetic information, that's all the building instructions in their DNA needed to produce all these different species. And of course, here the dotted lines do not represent millions of years and millions of generations. It's becoming increasingly clear that this kind of speciation can occur rapidly. It's this kind of family tree that we don't agree with and that we do not believe is well supported by science, one that shows that microbes evolved into man and that all other life forms are our distant cousins. Well, have you ever noticed the many similarities that exist between different animals? Many animals have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 4 limbs, a heart, a brain, fingers, toes, and so on. The natural world is full of these kinds of patterns. And evolutionists have a special term that they use to refer to these similarities. They call them homologies, or homologous organs, or homologous structures. That's a key word for this presentation. Homologies. Homologies simply refer to similarities which, according to evolutionists, are due to their having been inherited from a common ancestor. So, according to evolutionists, the eyes of these creatures on the bottom line are homologous organs because they are understood to have been inherited from a common ancestor that had eyes. Similarly, the legs of these creatures are said to be homologous structures because they are understood to have been inherited from a common ancestor that had legs. So looking at the diagram here, again, frogs, and turtles, birds and people are all said to possess eyes and legs because they inherited them from a common ancestor that looked something like this. Now, if you open a typical biology textbook that teaches evolution, you will probably find a diagram something like this one here. It shows the forelimbs or front legs or arms of various animals. We can see here the seal limb, the frog arm, the bird wing, and the human arm. And someone has very helpfully coloured the bones so that we can see their similarities clearly. And indeed, the similarities are striking. Each of these limbs has a humerus shown in green. a radius shown in blue, an ulna shown in brown, and the digits shown in yellow. That's the fingers, thumbs, and toes, the digits. And of course, evolutionists argue that there's a very straightforward explanation for these similarities. They were inherited, they say, from a common evolutionary ancestor and modified slowly by evolution over millions of years. The forelimbs, they claim, are an excellent example of homology. And perhaps more than anything else, this kind of diagram has convinced many people that evolution is true. However, as with all arguments for evolution, when we scratch beneath the surface, when we look at the details, we find that the evolutionary argument collapses. Let's see how this evolutionary argument collapses when it's subject to scrutiny. Now, humans and frogs both have digits. That's fingers, thumbs, and toes. Now, if humans and frogs have digits because they inherited them from a common ancestor, we would expect their digits to grow in a similar way in the embryo. We would expect the embryonic development of the digits in humans and frogs to be basically the same as the common ancestor from which they are allegedly descended. But digit development in humans and frogs is different. In humans, we start off with a spade-like structure, and the digits, the fingers and the toes, develop through the material between them dissolving away. The material between the digits is removed. That's how your fingers developed when you were in your mother's womb. In frogs, it's different. The digits grow outwardly and independently from buds. The material is added. Now, if evolution were the correct explanation for why humans and frogs both have digits, we would expect their embryonic development to be similar. We would expect humans and frogs not only to have inherited the digits, but also the same process of digit development. And these are no isolated examples. The embryonic development of the so-called homologous structures is often different, and I'm not just referring to limbs. As far back as 1894, the American embryologist Edmund Wilson wrote this: "It's a familiar fact that parts which are undoubtedly homologous often differ widely in their mode of formation." And according to the Harvard University embryologist Dr. Perry Alberch, such differences are the rule rather than the exception. If evolution were true, we would expect it to be the very opposite. We would expect it to be the rule rather than the exception that the similar structures, the homologous structures, develop in a similar way. Gunter Wagner is Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. And he wrote this: "The disturbingly many and deep problems associated with any attempt to identify the biological basis of homology have been presented repeatedly." And note, this is an evolutionist speaking. Now, they tell the youngsters in the schools and the students in the universities and the general public that evolution is the great unifying principle in biology. They tell us that Darwin explained the diversity of life. The celebrated evolutionist Theodosius Dobzhansky assured us nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But this is simply not true. The reality is that attempts to reconcile the facts of biology with Darwin's theory give rise to many and deep problems. Now, Gavin de Beer was one of the foremost embryologists of the last century. He was a fellow of the Royal Society in Britain and went on to become the director of the Natural History Museum in London. And in 1971, he wrote a monograph, a paper, which he entitled Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Now, Gavin de Beer was an evolutionist. He believed in Darwin's theory of evolution. But he couldn't reconcile this with the facts of embryology. In his paper, he gave a number of examples of homologous structures that developed in very different ways, from different parts of the egg and different parts of the embryo, and under the control of different genes. It was a mystery to him because it flew in the face of what he expected to find as an evolutionist. Hence the title of his paper, Homology, an Unsolved Problem. And he never solved the problem, and nor has anybody else. So what are we to make of all the similarities in nature? Why do so many animals have 2 eyes, 2 ears, a heart, lungs, and so on? Why are the forelimbs of all these animals so very similar? Why is the natural world so full of these kinds of patterns? Well, normally when people see a pattern, they think there must have been a designer. And surely, in the absence of a satisfactory evolutionary explanation, strong patterns in the natural world point to this: a designer, a creator. And common anatomy unifies the natural world and points to there being just one creator. There aren't many gods and many creators who have made radically different life forms from fundamentally different parts. There's one God, the Creator, and his creation reflects this. So how might we view the natural world from a biblical perspective, from the perspective of the Bible? Well, the Bible tells us that around 4,500 years ago, the natural world was destroyed by a global flood. In Genesis chapter 6 and verses 5 to 7, we read that the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth. And in verse 17, God said, I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. God also said to Noah, you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. So all air-breathing land animals were destroyed, except those that were preserved in the ark. And then from these small number of animals, the world that we know today was repopulated. And we note again the emphasis on kinds. Noah didn't take with him into the ark a pair of every species. He took with him into the ark a pair of each kind of animal. Noah probably took with him, for example, a pair of the cat kind, from which all the different cats now found on the earth are descended: lions, tigers, leopards, domestic cats, and so on. The ark would probably have had a pair of the dog kind, from which all the different dogs now found on the earth are descended: wolves, coyotes, foxes, and domestic dogs. There would have been a pair of the horse kind, from which all the horses seen today are descended. But how did this variation arise? How did a pair of the cat kind become all the different cats? How did a pair of the horse kind become all the different horses? Well, it seems clear that God brought to the ark animals that had an inbuilt capacity to vary. Animals that were packed with all the genetic information, that's all the building instructions in their DNA, needed to produce many different species, and quite rapidly. Now, that doesn't mean that apes that disembarked the ark would have carried the genetic information, the building instructions in their DNA to become humans. Rather, they would have carried the genetic information to become other species within the ape kind. But how did all this happen? Well, there are a number of possibilities. Firstly, speciation could have arisen through animals giving birth to offspring with significant variation. The different species could then have migrated to areas or ecological niches where they felt comfortable. The rate of speciation, though, would probably have been much faster than we see today. Secondly, it's becoming increasingly clear that animals can change to suit their environments, by which I mean that the conditions in which they live, perhaps the climate or the nature of the food, can trigger changes. Now, in 1971, some lizards were transported, they were moved from one island to another off the coast of Croatia. And although similar in climate, the two islands afforded very different types of food. The island from which the lizards were taken provided a diet mainly of insects, whereas the new island provided a diet mainly of plants. In less than 38 years, the lizards that had been moved to the new island had changed significantly. Remarkable changes were seen in their head shapes and head sizes. Scientists think to increase their bite force. And also significant changes were seen in their stomachs. In fact, they had even grown a new valve, a ring of muscle in their stomachs to slow down the passage of food, to aid digestion of the plant material. All this in less than 38 years. So that's another way that speciation could have occurred, by programmed change, by changes driven by the program in the DNA, which God put into the animals when he first created them, and triggered or switched on by the environment. In this case, a new food source. A third way that new species could have arisen is through natural selection. We saw earlier how natural selection could have helped produce different species of finch, For example, as only finches with the right beak shapes survived on each of the Galapagos Islands. Natural selection may also have helped shape powerful predators, as only the strongest and most fit were able to hunt successfully and obtain food. But it's important to note that natural selection is not the same as evolution. And this is because natural selection can't create anything. Natural selection just acts upon or tests for fitness that which already exists. Natural selection does not produce new genes. It can't write new building instructions. The only way that natural selection can produce new species is if animals start with lots of potential for variation. And this, of course, is what biblical creationists believe. The animals that stepped off the ark were packed with all the genetic information, all the building instructions in their DNA needed to produce lots of variation, lots of variety within each kind. Now, Darwinists, of course, argue that mutations can produce new genetic information. They say that random changes in DNA wrote new building instructions gradually over millions of years. All the new building instructions required to turn microbes into men. But this isn't because they see this happening in nature or in the laboratory. Studies of mutations show them to be destructive. Evolutionists have great faith in the ability of mutations to write new building instructions. But observations show that mutations virtually always cause organisms to lose genetic information, not to gain it. No realistic mathematical study or computer simulation has ever shown Darwin's theory to be credible, even given millions of years. So in summary, everything we know from chemistry and biology tells us that life will not arise from non-life by natural processes. The special molecules needed for even the simplest forms of life are many and complex, and they would break down in a chemical soup rather than build themselves up. These facts lead to what we might refer to as the law of biogenesis, that living things arise only from other living things. Numerous attempts to falsify this statement have all failed, and it is therefore arguably as much a part of true science as the law of gravity. There's plenty of evidence that plants and animals can vary within their kinds, even to the point of becoming new species. But what we observe in nature indicates that there are strict limits to the extent to which plants and animals can change. Fish remain fish, reptiles remain reptiles, birds remain birds, and apes remain apes. No scientist has ever shown that there's a natural process that can change apes into people. These observations lead to what we might refer to as the law of heredity, that living things arise from other living things of the same kind. Okay, well, that's the end of the presentation, the official presentation.